files that will be referenced. I'm not going to go like, directly down those files, but maybe if you wanted to have those pulled up, that's fine. If you didn't pull them up and you just used the sort of notes that you would normally use, I think that that would be fine. The purpose of having an opening packet is that back in the day, there used to be debate camps where everyone arrived and there had been no research done on the topic. The students started to do research on the topic, and what was discovered was it would take a week or more before the students would actually begin debating. So we have found that devoting one opening discussion to explaining the evidence that we give you just helps early debates go a little bit better. I mean, you would all be well within your rights to say, I don't know anything about arms sales. I don't know anything about Taiwan. How am I expected to debate in the next few days? When you feel that, please keep in mind that the people that you're debating against are in the same boat, and that it's all for practice, and that when September hits, you'll have a huge advantage relative to people who, at the first time, they'll be saying, I don't know anything about arms sales, or very little about Taiwan. It doesn't mean that Taiwan's the only important area of the topic. Maggie outlined several other ones. This is designed to make the next few days a little bit more comfortable. As I give you an opportunity to pull up any of those files or set aside a section for notes, let me ask a question to the group totally or mostly unrelated to the discussion today. Raise your hands if you've ever traveled to China. Okay. All right. Ooh, Dr. Gallo, where'd you go?
Shanghai, Wuxi.
Okay. All right, now raise your hand if you've been to Taiwan. Interesting. All right. Can you tell me anything loudly about your trip to Taiwan?
It's like an island.
It's like an island. I agree with that. Can you tell me something other than the island fact about Taiwan? I saw your name book. What's your name?
Michaela.
Michaela. Okay. You're my last name?
Yes.
All right. Great. Tell me, what do you know about Taiwan? Taipei is the capital. All right. We have 2 things down. Anyone else want to throw out a fun fact about Taiwan that they know? You don't even need to have gone. Go ahead over here. Originally established as a Portuguese colony. We'll talk about you're getting into some deep history. I'll talk a little bit more, slightly more modern history. Go ahead.
It's formally known as the Republic of China.
It's formally known as the ROC. We'll talk about that. Good. All right. Anything else? Over here. Go ahead. Loud, loud. What's your name?
It's like disputes its sovereignty with China.
So there's a fight with China as to whether or not Taiwan is its own thing. Last one.
There was fight by Japan until after World War II.
All right, there's a history with Japan, and we'll discuss that as well. Okay, a little bit of backstory. Interesting. Okay. One more question. Raise your hand if you've been to both China and Taiwan. Okay, so very few people. Very cool. All right. All right, so let's jump into the discussion. All right. So the history of the United States' relationship with China is very, very similar to someone that you may be dating that refuses to be Facebook official. The United States has a relationship with Taiwan. I may have misspoke. The United States' relationship with Taiwan is not really very Facebook official. The United States has a relationship with Taiwan, but its relationship falls short of being similar to the relationship that the United States has with most other governments. There's no doubt that the United States recognizes Germany as a country, all right? But there's unique complications that make it so the United States may not want to and has chosen not to make highly formal its relationship with Taiwan. It's starting to get more complicated in the Trump administration, and we'll talk about that. But a big thing, if you're only going to take away a few things from this lecture, is that in the same way one could hit the "it's complicated" button in a relationship status, the United States would hit that button with Taiwan and say, the United States' formal relationship with Taiwan is complicated. Here's the map. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because Maggie actually had a map as well. You see where Taiwan is. Its capital is Taipei. And as correctly pointed out, it is an island. Gotcha. Okay. For a long time, it was owned by Japan. And now it is a little bit more complicated of a history. Also, as pointed out, the phrase ROC is an acronym, and looking through the packet, there's a lot of acronyms on this topic. And the ROC stands for the Republic of China. And when people are making a reference to the ROC, they're making a reference to what you would understand to be Taiwan, or the governing entities on the island from the previous page. Because there are some people who live in Taiwan that believe that they are the true China, sometimes in order to provide verbal clarity, instead of saying China, you say the PRC, which is the People's Republic of China. But most of the time when people use the phrase China, they are referring to the green section, okay? But just know that there are some people in Taipei that would say that they are in fact the real China. So for clarity, PRC refers to the governing entities in Beijing, or really the country is an even better way to put it, that was in green. The phrase one China policy or one China principle is somewhat important because it gets at the difference between the way the United States recognizes the PRC and recognizes the ROC, or the one China policy is the way that the United States navigates the fact that it does have a relationship with both China and Taiwan. I'll explain this more in a moment, and you're welcome to ask questions, but it is a big deal in Beijing, in the green part of the map, that there only be one China in the eyes of the world. The people in Beijing do not care for the idea that there is a second China and that there might be a real China in the island of Taiwan. And so, the United States agreed that the United States, for the purposes of like international exchanges, would honor the idea that there was one China. But what that means is a little vague, because the United States definitely has a complicated relationship where we're kind of dating Taiwan too. The reason I put up the phrase one China policy or one China principle is not only to help you with your search terms when you do research, but know that the phrase one China principle is the phrase that Beijing uses when they refer to it. And like a principle is something that would stand over time, okay? And that one China policy is what the United States uses, which maybe implies that it's the way that the policy is now, but could potentially be subject to change. When I draw the analogy to being complicated or not Facebook official, the phrase in the literature, when you were to read an article, that's used is strategic ambiguity or deliberate ambiguity. Who wants to take a guess as to what that might mean? Don't be afraid to raise your hand. Go ahead, Flavia.
Like maybe that like it's a mutual relationship that doesn't like the United States doesn't really prefer to have like that relationship with all of those countries.
Okay. So if you couldn't hear Flavia, Flavia said the United States kind of intentionally doesn't tilt its relationship too much towards the PRC or the ROC. Anyone else want to take a guess at what strategic ambiguity might mean? Okay, if you were dating someone that was ambiguous, they would not tell you, they would be vague about whether or not you were a couple, whether or not you were Facebook official, etc. Strategic or deliberate ambiguity is the United States intentionally not clarifying what its relationship is with Taiwan. I'll say that again. Strategic ambiguity is the United States intentionally not clarifying its relationship with Taiwan. The United States wants a Goldilocks style, not too hot, not too cold, relationship with Taiwan. They want the porridge to be warm. If the United States were to be very, very obvious that it had a relationship with Taiwan, that would complicate ambiguity. It would be as though you'd been dating someone for a while and you'd been on its complicated status, and even though you were still technically on that status, you were out in public and obviously dating. It would also mean that if the United States was like way too nice to China or broke ties with Taiwan, that it might be over as a relationship. The ambiguity and informal nature of it is something that the United States has tried to intentionally maintain for several different U.S. presidents. Here are some facts that might help you understand the tension that exists between the PRC, Beijing, and the ROC, Taiwan. There was a long Chinese Civil War, like back in the day, like Mahoney style, old school, all right? And the war was between the entity that still governs China now and the entity which still governs Taiwan now. So the Chinese Communist Party, which sometimes appears as CPC, sometimes appears as CCP, all right? But the communist entity which governs Beijing, that same party, was in a fight with Taiwan, or the ROC. That fight got very, very hot at the end of World War II, between 1945 and 1949. And the ROC basically lost control of the green area of the map and fled, retreated, is a technical word, to the island of Taiwan. And from 1949 to 1952 was especially confusing because this island was owned by Japan, and there was definitely tension between the ROC and the PRC, but they were kind of chilling in an island. And then Taiwan was like, we're done with that island. And so the Republic of China was like, we're gonna like run the show here, okay? So think about how awkward that would be if Virginia just kind of got into a war with Washington, D.C., and the forces that were on Virginia kind of fled to an island, all right? And then that island, they started governing that island. Like, that's a very complicated thing. And that fundamental dynamic, even though new people have taken over the government in Beijing, there's new names, and there are new names involved in governing in the ROC in Taiwan, the same parties have lived on, and people that are still passionate about this issue have continued to exert an influence. And so while China and Taiwan are not formally in a hot war where missiles are flying, there's always been an underlying tension, and the tension is how independent does Taiwan get to be? Is it its own thing, or is it Virginia? Some questions for you. Take a second, think of your answers, and I will call on some people. When I call on you, introduce your name to the group. Think about your answers to those 3 questions. Question number 1. Does China think Taiwan is independent as a country? What's your name?
My name is Marina,
Hi, Marina.
and China does not think that Taiwan is independent.
Yeah, the answer to question number 1 is uber false, okay? It is a big deal in Chinese circles that Taiwan can have its own government in the same way that Virginia has its own government, but it is not an independent country. Okay. Does the United States have a formal relationship with Taiwan? Go ahead. What's your name?
Carlos,
Hi, Carlos.
no.
It's pretty much no. It got a little bit more complicated in March of 2018, which I will explain in a moment. But the United States instead is strategically ambiguous about whether or not it is formally dating Taiwan. Why would China care if the United States had a formal relationship with Taiwan? Go ahead. What's your name?
Allie,
Hi, Allie.
China might care if the US had a formal relationship with Taiwan because it could like affect their allyship and their relations with each other, and it could also increase tension between countries.
Okay, who wants to give, and I don't disagree with any of that, who wants to give more? Go ahead. What's your name?
Aliza.
Aliza. Hi.
Another reason they would probably care is because it violates the one China policy or principle. That
Okay.
the US.
All right. Aliza, I'm going to throw a question at you that you didn't have any prep time for.
Okay.
Why would they care if the United States sold arms to Taiwan?
Well, I mean, it's basically saying if you sold arms, then I feel like that would be recognizing Taiwan as its own entity in a sense, if it's selling it to Taiwan and not directly to CRC.
Okay. Go ahead. What's your name?
Alani,
Hi, Alani.
I think that in the same sense that she was saying, China sees Taiwan as a threat to its not only culture but communism.
Okay.
So if the U.S. were to aid Taiwan, in a sense, it would view that as not only a threat of Taiwan, but as it sees the U.S. as a bigger enemy.
Can I give you a question with no prep time as well? What if China sold weapons to Virginia?
Like their state.
Yeah. How would Trump react to that?
He would view it as a threat as well because it's. He also wants to see more commercial, like domestic sales within the U.S. So he would see it as a threat to national security if another country is coming in and supporting almost a rogue state.
So it's very, go ahead.
My name is Tatiana.
Hi, Tatiana.
Also, additionally, it's completely unconstitutional. So all military actions are supposed to be like the government involved with that, not individual states.
And so in China, in these circles, China wants there to be unity in the same way that the United States doesn't want Virginia to kind of have its own weapon systems, if that makes sense. And so it is especially threatening when arms sales are given to a contested area. And maybe the way in which China is so hot about this issue makes more sense when you think about it in the manner of how Trump might be really hot if a comparable arms sale occurred to a US state. And that is, they technically view Taiwan, China technically views Taiwan as a province. That's maybe a term to remember. And if you were to sell arms to a Canadian province, you would anger the central government in Canada. So, here's the question that you I sort of teased when I talked to Carlos, that there was a complicated answer to whether or not the United States and Taiwan have a relationship. In 1979, the United States basically said we are going to formalize a one China policy, and the answer was therefore no. We are going to be a little bit more pro-Beijing, and we are not going to officially recognize Taiwan. We will recognize that there is one China. As part of this, however, there was something called the TRA, more acronym soup, and that is the Taiwan Relations Act, where the United States sort of hedged its bet and it said, but we will retain a relationship with the people of Taiwan. So that's like classic government doublespeak, because therefore you can do anything to Taiwan and have any relationship with them, and it helps the people of Taiwan. Well, however complicated that was, for 40 years it was pretty much good to go. And the United States was not having formal diplomatic exchanges where US officials would make high-level visits to Taiwan, or that officials from Taipei were not doing the same. And then in March of 2018, Trump passed something called the Taiwan Travel Act, which allowed those high-level visits. And people saw that as a very scary change that maybe complicated ambiguity, because it's not very ambiguous if you're allowing another country to send high-level officials to your country and vice versa. It's not as though no one from Taiwan had ever gone to the US or vice versa. People in the room raised their hand and they had been to the Republic of China. What was different was formal high-level visits were now allowed, and that seemed to be a big change. So the affirmative is going to want to argue that in the tilt that Flavia mentioned, the tilt is sort of starting to tilt enough towards Taiwan that China is like, what's going on here? This isn't as ambiguous or vague as it had been for the 40 previous years. Okay, we're now going to turn it over to Professor Tyler Thur. Mr. Thur cut most of the evidence for the opening packet. Let us thank him for his labor. He's going to rattle off some facts that you can jot down, and we can also pose some questions at this point, although we have a lot more to still get to. I turn it over to Tyler.
Okay, I'll be super quick because Will has this awesome line of history, and obviously I know you want to get into some of the intricacies. But Will wanted me just to put into context a little bit what some of our arms sales look like, and the extent to which they're increasing or decreasing. So, as Maggie sort of outlined at the end of her lecture, you can see that over time there's this ebb and flow of increasing and decreasing arms sales. And part of that reflects the relationship between US presidents and Taiwanese leaders in the broader context of Chinese relations. But the other piece of it is that there's this big wave of arms sales, and then sort of a period in which the procurement spreads itself out and arms are disseminated. So what I wanted to do was to give just a little bit of information to say, what is the Trump administration doing, and what does that look like? Thus far in the administration, there have been two major arms packages between the United States and Taiwan. And they include a variety of weapons, but two big chunks. The first one came in June of 2017, June of 2017, and that was for $1,363,000,000. Okay? To me, that doesn't really mean all that much. I wanted to put it in context. If you were to go out and take that amount of money, you could go to Best Buy, right down the street in Oasis, and purchase 500,000 15-inch MacBook Pros. And don't worry, I triple checked, those are the ones with the touch bar. You're getting like the full service MacBooks here, big spending. Or if that number like still doesn't totally fit for you and you're like in the third camp, you're thinking about food, of course. What's the greatest restaurant in the history of the world? Oh, close. Taco Bell. Chipotle doesn't want you when you don't have money. Taco Bell has you. So if you were to take those arms sales, in addition to a second set of arms sales in October of 2018, which was for $330 million, you could purchase 846,500,000 beefy nacho grillers. You'd be a very happy person, right? Delicious nacho grillers from Taco Bell. All right. So in total, the Trump administration has sold $1,693,000,000 to Taiwan in arms sales. A lot of money that you can contextualize in that broader context. Just as like a weird fun fact and aside, that amount of money is more than the gross domestic product. So all of the incoming money to the economies of a variety of countries, including Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean, Guinea-Bissau in Africa, and San Marino in Europe, which is interesting if you ask me. The one thing I did want to note, though, is that there's still a lot of room for increased Taiwanese arms sales. So in addition to that $1,693,000,000 total that's been sold in those two series of arms sales thus far, the Trump administration has proposed selling $2 billion more in arms in this forthcoming year to Taiwan. There's a lot to still sort of work out there. And Taiwan has a huge push in their current domestic political climate for increased arms sales. So in particular, there has been a push by the SDI government, which is the current leadership in Taiwan, to increase its defense budget to $11,340,000,000 in the upcoming year, and by 2027, boost that up to $13 billion, right? So there's a huge push and a huge demand for U.S. arms, and there's even some capacity for Taiwan to sort of reach that. Just as a quick comparison, does anyone know how much the U.S.'s defense budget was in this most recent year? Taiwan was, they're shooting for it. They're like, we got this, we're going to build up, we're going to get to $13 billion. How much was the U.S.? Any ideas? Yeah? Close, 650. Any other guesses? It was $693 billion. Okay? So small potatoes compared to the US, but there's still a huge amount of arms. Okay? So don't worry about like all of the tiny intricate details. The big picture is we sell a lot of arms to Taiwan. There's a capacity to double the amount sold under the Trump administration so far, in part because of rising Taiwanese defense expenditures. But even at the end of the day, that's still a small fraction of what the U.S. is broadly committed to.
Thank you, fun fact. I did not know that was going to go down the path of Taco Bell.
Yeah, that's the biggest takeaway from this lecture. It's always there for you. Every day in the afternoons, they have $1 Baja Blast freezes, which yeah, that's good.
There you go. How about this? The United States already is selling a bunch of weapons to Taiwan, and quite a lot of them. And the real issue is whether or not the United States will continue to sell more advanced weapons to Taiwan. One thing I guess I want to say before you look at this next slide is consider what conflict between quote-unquote mainland China, the green thing, and Taiwan would look like. It wouldn't really be all about troops. It would be a lot of variables, because it is an island, would relate to whether or not Taiwan had good submarines and whether or not they had good jets. And that just has to do with the unique nature of being an island, etc. Now, when you have your first debate, and some of you won't have your first debate for a few days yet, The affirmative can choose in your first debate between these two plans. They are remarkably similar. Take a read of both of them, all right, and tell me how they differ from one another, all right? And I will echo that when it's time to debate, please read only one plan. Take a moment and tell me how option 1 and option 2 differ. Some of you are squinting. All right, who wants to share with me what they think the difference might be? Go ahead, what's your name?
Faith.
Hi, Faith.
I think maybe this is because how option 2 has higher revenue.
Right.
Option 1 is just sales.
Yes. So the trick between option 1 and option 2, and Tyler wrote it, we'll let him expand upon this if you'd like. But to me, the trick is that option 1 just kind of reduces all of it, all right, or a lot of stuff, and that option 2 maybe could continue to sell them the mediocre stuff, okay, but it would definitely not sell them the coolest, newest, quote unquote, high-end submarines or fighter jets or things like that. And that might be tricky because the affirmative might be saying, we're going to continue to have arms sales to Taiwan. We're not getting rid of all of it, but we're getting rid of the stuff that might be the most terrifying to Beijing. Tyler, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that's perfect. The other thing I would consider really, really briefly is the broader strategic consideration of being small versus being large. Obviously, you all are going to get these awesome topicality seminars forthcoming. And if you're that topicality guy Will was referencing in the opening lecture yesterday, seeing this trick sort of be deployed and described of just ending high-end weapons might set off some alarm bells for T-significant or other considerations of what the affirmative is required for. So there's always these strategic costs and always these strategic benefits. And think about how much you care about maybe having some greater topicality concerns versus having some greater links to disad concerns. It's the inherent trait.
So there are 3 advantages in the opening packet, and after you chose one of the 2 options for your plan, you usually are going to choose 2 of the 3 advantages. Maybe someone in the camp is super fast and can try to read all 3 of them, but you know, even Tyler, and he was a college debater, would struggle to fit in all 3 of them. So you might want to choose a smaller range of options. The CCP, to repeat, is the Chinese Communist Party, and it is the governing entity in Beijing. Your argument might result in war, but your argument is more complicated than simply arguing that these arms sales cause a whole bunch of people to get into fights with those arms. Instead, your argument is that the CCP has a communist governing model which is sort of popular with the citizens of China, but also not entirely popular with the citizens of China, and that the CCP, the governing entity in Beijing, wants to look good. It wants to look like it's in charge. In the same way that if arms sales to Virginia might make Trump look as though he's not governing over a United States of America, when arms sales are going to what Beijing believes to be a province, it looks as though they're not really running the show. And so they start to act a little bit more boldly, not because they're mad, but because they want to shore up their credibility. They want to prove that they're in charge. And sometimes, when you start a war, everyone supports you. George W. Bush was actually not a terribly popular president, but when George W. Bush initiated a war on terrorism, or even at the opening portion of the war against Iraq, there was a whole bunch of people who might not have otherwise supported the president, but felt as though the country should be united in a time of war. That sort of rally around the president or rally around the flag effect argues that when countries feel that they have lost credibility, they can be more aggressive in a matter like the military in order to gain more universal support. And so the CCP advantage isn't about China starting a war with Taiwan. China could start a war over many different disputed territories, including some in the South China Sea, other regions in Asia. But the point is, it's not a good idea to make a powerful country look bad and then to wait and find out how they will react. They'll probably make actions that are a little bit too assertive and could cause tension. Anyone want to ask any questions about that? That's complicated in my opinion. That's a little complicated. Hi, I forgot your name.
Tatiana.
Tatiana. Where are you from, Tatiana?
Detroit.
Detroit, Michigan. I know well. Go ahead.
Okay, so I haven't completely developed my question yet, but
Yes.
I don't have one. So I'm gonna say, so basically, what China's doing is, like, the advantage is the only reason that they're gonna start war is if they don't have enough, like, people to support them. Or if we do start a war with somebody, we're gonna need the support from people.
So selling arms to Taiwan hurts their cred. They think that they look bad, okay, to their own people, etc. So to bolster their cred, they start acting like the tough guy, and not necessarily just in the issue of Taiwan, but kind of everywhere.
So what do you mean by acting like the tough guy?
Maybe they would, in order to demonstrate that they were in control, maybe they would move more ships to disputed islands, or get into it with more neighboring countries. Does that make sense? And then all of that sort of unravels. So you want to argue that arms sales by the United States to what China perceives to be a province makes the governing entity in China feel as though it's obligated to kind of rise up a little bit. Does that make sense? And in that rise, things will not go well. Does that help a little bit, Tatiana? I think that's a good question. I think this is confusing. I think the other ones are not as confusing as this one, which is why I listed this one first. Maybe this will help it sink in. Okay, what would Donald Trump do if China sold arms to Virginia? All right, Donald Trump would immediately be nervous that his credibility was at stake, and who knows what would happen if he felt that his credibility was at stake. And so that is sort of an analogy on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. Okay. The second option, if you don't like that one, well, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, all right? So, again, acronym soup, and I don't need you to write all this down. All the stuff that starts with F is just a synonym for really advanced jets and airplanes, okay? Tyler wants to unpack the details, that's fine, but like the V stands for Viper, and it's a jet that can go 1,500 miles per hour, which is like disgustingly fast, okay? And so it's way better than the jets that Taiwan currently has. And the reason that the second bullet point is up there is that there's a fine line. The United States has said, we're not going to be Facebook official with Taiwan. We're only going to sell them defensive weapons. Okay, well the phrase defensive weapons sounds weird, right? But we can all envision something like a can of, a spray can of mace being a defensive weapon only. And in theory, if you were to sell a jet to Taiwan, they could only use it if they got attacked. And so therefore they could only use it against China if someone, came in to Taiwan's airspace, and then they could use it. But as the weapons that we sell to Taiwan get more and more high-end, then China gets nervous that even though these are clarified to be defensive weapons, they're super, super fast and they're super, super powerful, and they have to account for the idea that maybe at some point they won't only be playing defense. Maybe they'll have a missile on them. And if China doesn't have a jet that is as fast as the one that Taiwan has, then it's not really feeling defensive or ambiguous anymore. A phrase that appears in the opening packet is the gray zone, all right? And I wrote out that definition there. But the point of the gray zone is that instead of being ambiguous, you could maybe take a weapon like a new awesome fighter jet and you could kind of push the boundaries. Does anyone have any questions about the specific weapons or details that I've kind of unpacked in terms of what the United States is selling to Taiwan? A little bit high-end, a little bit confusing. I think the easiest advantage to kind of understand thesis style is that U.S. arms sales to Taiwan hurt the United States' overall relationship with Beijing. We've kind of hinted at this many times already, that if China were to sell weapons to Virginia, that would hurt the Chinese leadership's relationship with the U.S. president, and the same is true in reverse. The United States and China are two of the most powerful, if not the two most powerful and influential nations on earth. They have enormous economies. They have enormous militaries. The ideas that they would be friends is probably an overall good idea. And the affirmative is arguing that arms sales just complicate it, and that China is so hot about Taiwan arms sales because of the history, because of everything that I led with, that it's not just a minor deal to them. It's a big deal to them, and such a big deal that it could complicate the ability to have a breakthrough in trade talks, or to have a cooperative relationship on issues of disease. The word proliferation is a word that usually means like countries acquiring new weapons. And in the United States and China can cooperate on all of those issues in order to make the world a healthier, safer place. Does anyone want to pose any questions about any of that? Don't be afraid. Yes, what's your name?
Nicholas.
Hi, Nicholas.
Hi. I was wondering if there was a definition in the evidence of what a high-end weapon is. Where's the line?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that vaguely, and I'll see if Tyler can point you to like a precise piece of evidence. Okay, but the question that Nicholas had, if you couldn't hear it, is there a precise definition of what's high-end? And the real answer to your question is new equipment in the realm of jets or submarines that move Taiwan's defense capabilities to being potentially offensive, okay? So if a sub in Taiwan is now better than the one that China has, then it can't just defend. If it was what's called submarine warfare, it then could maybe play an offensive role. So once Taiwan's weapons move from being okay enough to play defense to being high-end enough to create the possibility of aggression, that's when China's calculations change. I'll turn it over to Tyler to answer the high-end question.
I look broadly at the Hunter and Lancosa article. There's a card in the 1AC on the war advantage that begins with the tag, more broadly, Taiwan's reliance on U.S. arms and high-end weapons. And that starts to lay out the process. But exactly what Will says. It's the reliance on technology for indigenous subs, its reliance on the U.S. for fighter jets, all those like really big, high visibility, high profile things.
All right, it seems like Faith had a question. Am I right? Go ahead.
Just for context, well, how exactly does the cooperation between USA and China work in terms of trading?
Yeah, so that's I think a great question. If you couldn't hear Faith's question, it's like, how are the United States and China cooperating right now? Okay, so the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues in the whole world right now, is whether or not Trump and President Xi from China will sign a trade deal. It might happen, it might not happen. It's kind of been on again, off again a whole bunch. The reason it's such a big deal is that it's the two largest economies in the whole world. And so it would really matter to the global economy if the two of them decided to have a good relationship in the realm of trade. I would say on the other areas, the United States and China do cooperate, but the affirmative would want to argue that they could sure stand to cooperate better. The United States and China, like, they have an embassy, they're friends with one another, but no one would pretend that their relationship is just like always rosy, if that makes sense. And so the affirmative's always going to want to argue that there's potential for this relationship to unravel, and that selling arms to Taiwan is not a good way to keep the relationship healthy. I saw some more hands up over here. Go ahead. Loud.
Hi, Shannon.
Hi, Shannon. I think we met yesterday. How are you? Yeah.
And then there were a couple points about election tampering.
Right.
So where does that fit into the whole conflict situation?
Right. Yeah, I forgot to include that on this list. One of the arguments is that if the United States and China not only are fighting, but they're specifically fighting over the area of Taiwan, that China will use its influence to tamper in Taiwan's elections. Even though Taiwan does not have its own international formal recognition from everyone, it does have leadership, okay? President Tsai was referenced earlier by Tyler. And if in their upcoming elections, Beijing were to interfere and to tilt that election one way or another, one of the arguments in the packet is that that would hurt global democracy, because Taiwan, which is seen as an alternative to the Chinese Communist Party and does have elections, would have elections that didn't mean as much because they had been tampered with. And I think you know the analogy to Russia tampering with elections, etc. Follow-up question.
So is that like one of their lash out methods? Like tell them to be like.
Yeah, they could get mad in a lot of ways, and yes, one of the ways in which they could lash out wouldn't be just to start a war, but to specifically tamper with Taiwan and to say, look, we're going to assert ourselves in this province of ours. There was another question. You're good? Go ahead.
I mean, I was just gonna ask, like, is nuclear, like, weapons being sold to China or Taiwan, is that, like, considered a high-end weapon?
So the United States isn't selling a lot of, okay, so a nuclear weapon is certainly a high-end weapon. And to be clear, the United States is not selling nuclear weapons to China or Taiwan. That would be like really high-end, okay? That's like the Rolls Royce of an arms sale, okay, all right? And I don't think the United States has sold a nuclear weapon to anyone, because that would just drive the world bonkers, basically. Yeah. Okay. All right, let's keep moving here. All right, the last affirmative advantage is about war, and it argues that arms sales to Taiwan actually increase the risk of war. And this is kind of tricky. The first reason, I think, is obvious, which is that, like, if you're selling high-end submarines and high-end air jets to Taiwan, China needs to strike while they still feel that they have the edge. Because if they're going to get the high-end stuff, you gotta move before you lose your edge. That one I think is pretty easy to understand. The second one, which is really kind of tricky and good research by Tyler, is that when Taiwan gets all this cool stuff from the United States, it wasn't really ever designed to fight China. It was designed in general for the United States to have, like, awesome fighter jets, etc. And that Taiwan would be better if it didn't have all of these awesome, tricky things from the United States, and it built its own set of weapons, because its own set of weapons are designed to prevent Chinese war. So even if they built a smaller, less cool sub, it would always have been built by people in Taiwan that have expertise in how to prevent a sub-conflict with China. So it's basically that the US has a cookie cutter set of arms sales that aren't as good as the ones that Taiwan would make themselves. That's a tricky argument. Do you want to add anything on that, Todd? Okay, things the negative might say. All right. First of all, these are switch-side baits, and you could go against this argument. And the negative might just be like, look, China's not going to overreact, even to high-end arms sales, because the United States, as Tyler rattled off, has sold like umpteen jillions worth of Taco Bell stuff to Taiwan already, and at no point has Beijing done anything more than express anger. Okay? Well, expressing anger is different than kind of overreacting. The second argument is the no big deal argument that Faith sort of got at, which is that there are lots of things going on in the US-China, Beijing relationship, okay? And China's not just going to like throw it all away because they're mad about Taiwan. Yes, Taiwan is a big deal in some ways, China, but so is trade, and so is disease co-op, and so is terror, and so is a million other things. And China is capable of compartmentalizing and being like, we're mad at you about Taiwan, but we'd still like to make a lot of money and forge a trade deal with you. We're mad at you about Taiwan, but it sure would be nice if you looked at these sanctions. And if they're so concerned with how legitimate they are, a good thing that could happen is for the Chinese economy to continue to be strong and to reap all the other benefits that come across in a relationship between the United States and China. The deterrence disadvantage means kind of what it sounds like, okay? Right? If you're trying to deter your parents from calling you all the time and sending you like these paragraph-long texts, you write like a series of one-word answers. Yes, no, not sure, okay? You are cultivating a deterrence relationship with your parents to prevent them from gobbling up too much of your time and the embarrassment of their extremely long texts. There's an argument that the United States' arms sales to Taiwan, okay, stop China from being aggressive. They signal to China that the United States sort of has Taiwan's back. And if we did less of that, maybe China would be like, here's our opening. To continue with the analogy, if instead of sending a short text back, you decided to just call your parents, who knows how long they would talk, okay? All right? So the United States is arguably deterring Beijing's aggression by continually selling weapons to Taiwan. Although they sound the same, deterrence is a little bit different than assurance. Deterrence is about Taiwan. Assurance is about what we're saying to the rest of the world. If you're Japan, if you're South Korea, you're nervous about Donald Trump. Donald Trump has said maybe allies aren't that important. Maybe allies should defend themselves. Donald Trump has said, I don't really know if NATO should kind of pick up more of the slack. And if we were to stop, if the United States were to stop arms sales to Taiwan, think about what it might say, not to Taiwan, but to every other country in the world. You'd have to worry that you might be next. If you're running a government in Seoul, South Korea, if you're running a government in Tokyo, Japan, you don't have nuclear weapons. You don't have a bunch of high-end weapons. Why? Because you rely on the United States. If North Korea were to go ballistic against South Korea can confidently rely on the United States. If China or North Korea were to be aggressive against Japan, ditto. But if the United States is getting out of its support for Taiwan, the negative is going to argue that Seoul, South Korea, and Tokyo, Japan don't feel assured. They're worried that it's contagious, and that the next country to lose their support from Washington, D.C. might be them. So they build weapons of their own. They destabilize the situation. It's not good when we revisit how they should defend themselves. The debt ceiling disadvantage is totally different, and some of you might have debated the debt ceiling politics disadvantage even last season. This is about U.S. domestic politics. Most people would argue that it is popular to sell weapons to Taiwan, especially popular in Republican circles. It doesn't just make money for arms contractors. It also definitely signals that the communists in Beijing might be wrong and that the democratic forces in Taiwan might be right. It is generally pretty easy to argue that support for Taiwan is something that a lot of people in the United States are on board for. Not all, but a lot. If the United States were to reduce or eliminate its arms sales to Taiwan, the thesis of the debt ceiling disadvantage is a huge political fight would erupt, and that huge political fight might complicate a very important negotiation that's going to occur in the fall over the debt ceiling. Now, your reaction to this is probably intuitively correct, which is that politicians in Washington, D.C. already fight all the time anyway. But the one thing that they actually kind of usually agree on is that we should have a higher debt ceiling. And maybe this requires me just explaining what the debt ceiling is. The United States spends more money than it takes in taxes. It has a debt. That debt is $22 trillion and change. Don't even ask Tyler to compute what $22 trillion means in Taco Bell. Okay? It's a lot of money. But it's not that big of a deal because the United States, in a magical feat, can get a whole bunch of other people to buy savings bonds and pay for the debt ceiling, pay for the debt. But there's a law which says we are not allowed to take on more debt. And that law is a ceiling. And what the United States government has done for some time, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, is continually raise that ceiling. That's why it's at $22 trillion now. And there's a strong consensus that it's a good idea to raise the ceiling, because if we don't raise the ceiling and allow more debt to be taken on, then the only way the government can pay for its debt is to cut back and to not pay out grandma on grandma's bond that grandma took out, or to cut off someone's Social Security benefits or something like that. And that has never happened. Not that it rarely happens. The United States has never missed a payment of that kind because the United States has always had an increasing ability to take on more debt, or to think of the analogy, to go above this ceiling if it needs to. But if the Congress can't agree to raise this ceiling, then it would be economic havoc, because for the first time ever, the United States would what's called default on its payments, and people would freak out. And you have to trust me, people would absolutely freak out if the government was not able to pay back its debt. And so the argument is, yes, DC does not cooperate now, but now is an especially bad time to get DC more angry at one another, because if politicians in DC get more angry at one another now, that will complicate a debt ceiling vote that's presently slated to take place in either like September or early October. So there's a politics disadvantage in the United States saying, don't rile up the politicians because there's an uber important vote on raising the debt ceiling. Raising the debt ceiling is good according to the negative, and It avoids economic chaos. That's a weird one, and a lot. Okay. I'm going to pause here for a second. Any questions about anything? The debt ceiling, deterrence, assurance, anything else with the negative mindset? Yes, what's your name?
Jake.
Hi, Jake.
Well, my question is, are there any arguments that are made for not raising the debt ceiling?
Are there affirmative arguments that could be made for not raising the debt ceiling? Sure, the affirmative could argue that if we keep taking on more debt, it would hurt the economy. The affirmative could argue that nothing about the Taiwan policy could complicate the desire to keep raising the debt ceiling. Things like that. It's a good question, Jake. Anything else? Go ahead, Faye.
How often does a vote on the debt ceiling?
Great question. If you didn't hear Faye's question, was how often do they vote on the debt ceiling? Okay? And they vote on the debt ceiling based upon how much the government is spending. So they only vote on it when it gets to the ceiling, okay? If you recall, the Trump administration passed a tax cut, and it thought that the tax cut was going to cause a whole bunch more money to come in. In a shocking development, the tax cut caused less money to come in, and so they kind of misprojected. And now they are saying that they are going to default on their debt sometime relatively soon. And so the debt ceiling vote has to take place before the default. And the default is a little bit difficult to exactly determine. All right? Steve Mnuchin, the guy that looks like John Oliver, is trying to figure it out. All right? And it's hard to calculate because money's kind of coming in and, you know, people pay their taxes at different cycles and whatnot. But I think that the government's going, this is like kind of a big deal for your life. I think that the government might default on its debt sometime in the next few months. And so they've got to have a vote before that. Any other questions? Yes, I forgot your name.
Allie.
Hi, Allie.
Is there a circumstance in which the debt ceiling keeps getting like constantly raised, but then there's
You are living in that world. The debt ceiling was much closer to this floor than it is now.
But like it keeps getting raised to the point where it can't be raised anymore, and then the U.S. crashes.
You can always raise the debt ceiling. That's just the amount of debt that the United States is allowed to take on. There might come a world where people are no longer interested in buying our debt. As an aside, Chinese investors buy like 20% of our debt. So there is a point at which just taking on like $100 trillion in debt might just be like more than we can handle. So the affirmative could argue at some point the bubble's going to burst and the United States is not going to be able to pay back its debt. But in theory, you could always keep raising it as long as someone would buy it. It's just like, think about your most irresponsible friend and their credit card. If they could always find someone to pay their credit card bill, they would be fine. But at some point, they might not be able to. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. I saw a hand up here. Other questions? Okay, so here's what I would like to do. First of all, I'd like to re-remind the EFLN lab to meet under the stairwell at the specified time, which I believe Bruce is 1:15. Okay? I am going to stay around here and answer questions because the cafeteria at lunch is its most crowded. If you want to ask individual questions to me, I'll stick around for a long time. If you want to beat the lunch rush, I recommend trying to get up there before noon when every other camp and everyone else in the city decides to eat at that cafeteria. Enjoy your first lunch. I hope you learned about the packet. Thanks.